Welcome to Chapter 8, Burdens of Proof and Standards of Review. This video will explore the fundamental mechanics of judicial proof within the immigration system. Our learning objectives are divided into core competencies and advanced application. Key goals include defining the burden of proof, explaining the different burdens used in removal proceedings, and distinguishing burdens of proof from standards of review. For advanced application, we'll focus on integrating evidentiary standards with practical litigation strategy and applying these concepts to real-world scenarios. Here are the key terms for this chapter: burden of proof, preponderance of the evidence, clear and convincing evidence, reasonable fear and credible fear, standard of review, de novo review, substantial evidence standard, and credibility determination. We will define each of these terms in detail throughout the video. The burden of proof involves three main aspects. The who determines which party must prove a claim. The how much sets the evidentiary threshold, like preponderance or clear and convincing standards. The what defines the admissible evidence required to satisfy the standard. These burdens are fundamental to every stage of a removal proceeding in immigration court. The Department of Homeland Security carries the primary obligation in removal proceedings. They must establish two critical elements by clear and convincing evidence: alienage, proving the respondent is not a U.S. citizen, and removability, proving a specific violation of immigration law. Failure to meet this high civil standard requires the case to be terminated immediately. Once removability is established, the burden shifts to the respondent to prove eligibility for relief. Different forms of relief require different burdens. Asylum requires a well-founded fear, a low standard. Withholding requires a, quote, clear probability, which is higher than 50% likelihood. CAT protection requires proving the respondent is more likely than not to be tortured. Other reliefs, like cancellation of removal and adjustment of status, have their own eligibility and discretion requirements. Credibility is central to meeting the burdens of proof. Immigration judges evaluate 5 elements: consistency, detail, demeanor, plausibility, and corroboration. Under the REAL ID Act, judges may require corroboration unless the respondent cannot reasonably obtain it. On appeal, the Board of Immigration Appeals applies specific standards of review. Questions of law receive de novo review, a fresh look without deference to the immigration judge. Findings of fact require substantial evidence, giving high deference to the original judge. Credibility determinations are overturned only in cases of clear error, where the record clearly contradicts the judge's assessment. Burdens and standards critically impact case outcomes through 4 core determinants: evidentiary volume, testimony weight, appellate review, and case outcome. These metrics form the mechanical spine of every immigration hearing. Students must understand these concepts to analyze cases effectively. In our weekly seminar review, we will address several discussion questions. For Monday, we ask why DHS carries the burden of proving removability. On Tuesday, why is the asylum burden lower than the withholding burden? For Wednesday, why are credibility findings difficult to overturn on appeal? Finally, on Thursday, we ask how do burdens of proof shape the outcome of a case? Our assessment questions for the week include: on Monday, define burden of proof. Tuesday, what is the burden for asylum? Wednesday, what is the substantial evidence standard? And Thursday, who carries the burden for cancellation of removal? We now analyze the case of Farah Ali, a 30-year-old Somali national seeking protection claims. The case involves gender-based violence and political persecution after her refusal to enter a forced marriage with an al-Shabaab militant. Her goal is to establish that her fear is a systematic risk, not merely anecdotal. The core conflict lies between the respondent's theory of persecution and the government's denial. The respondent argues she is a specific target rooted in PSG membership and imputed political opinion. The government counters with a defense of denial, minimizing the threat's severity and arguing she could safely relocate elsewhere. Navigating the burdens requires a clear legal strategy. For asylum's well-founded fear, we prove subjective fear with consistent testimony and objective evidence. For withholding's clear probability, we highlight the brother's disappearance as evidence of a deadly probability. For CAT protection, we argue the government's inability to protect her constitutes acquiescence under CAT standards. The evidence portfolio is crucial. A threat letter serves as the, quote, smoking gun of targeted harassment. A country conditions report overcomes the internal relocation argument. Finally, an affidavit and medical report provide third-party corroboration, establishing a narrative of documented facts that aligns with the testimony. We address two legal pain points in our strategic rebuttal. First, the internal relocation fallacy. The opposition argues Farah can safely relocate, but we counter that al-Shabaab's network renders internal safe zones non-existent for targeted individuals. Second, the credibility/corroboration threshold. Under the Real ID Act, credible witnesses should not be penalized for lacking evidence that is not reasonably available, which is often the case when fleeing a war zone. In conclusion, Farah Ali is a survivor of gender-based persecution who has exhausted all domestic remedies. We seek all three forms of relief: asylum based on a credible threat, withholding based on her brother's fatal disappearance, and cat protection, arguing the Somali government's inability to stop al-Shabaab creates a de facto environment of torture.